Hi there, and welcome to this episode 5 in the first series of Rethinking Human Factor here at Marmalade Box. My name is Bruce Hallis. I am the host of the show, and today it's going to be an absolute privilege to introduce you to a gentleman called Ciaran McMahaon, who I've now known for a couple of years, who comes from a psychology background. Now, for those of you who are new to the podcast, or those of you who maybe have even forgot what the podcast was about when we first started a little while ago, let me just briefly explain the format. You can think of this show as a shortcut mechanism to gain access to people who have done one of two things. They've either studied and researched at great depth the universal challenges of how to raise awareness, how to influence behavior, and how to develop and embed something within an organizational culture. The other type of guests that we have on the show are people who have worked within government, the private sector, or not-for-profit, and they have been facing the same challenges that our audience, the information security, cybersecurity audience, has been facing, which again is about, how do I raise awareness? How do I influence behavior? And how do I foster a culture where information security, cybersecurity is valued? And it's our belief, and the research that we've done has shown that actually, there are a lot of people out there that have faced that challenge and have overcome that challenge successfully. And so what we're trying to do is provide you with a shortcut to those people to get their insights to better help you develop a strategy within your organization to ensure greater levels of compliance with security best practice. Now, before we actually jump into the podcast, I just want to let you know that we had some internet connection issues when we were recording this. And so you might notice some digital noise in the background. We've done our utmost to try and clean up all that background noise. And we're still really genuinely excited to share the podcast with you today. So without further ado, here's my chat with Ciaran. Ciaran. Hi, Ciaran. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us all the way over from Dublin.
Good morning, Bruce.
If the reception between the two of us is garbled, that'll be the roughness of the Irish Sea between us at the moment.
Well, that sea is pretty rough today then, Bruce.
It is, okay. Well, I've known Ciaran a short period of time now. Well, I'd say short period, maybe a couple of years. We first met in Munich at an ISC Squared Congress event where we immediately found that we had something in common, which is, a belief in, you need to understand the human side of things if you ever want to stand a chance of influencing good, positive security behaviors within an organization. Ciaran and I have spent the last year, along with Jess Kerr-Barker, actually doing a workshop with ISC Squared, tackling the issues of awareness, behavior, and culture. And actually, Ciaran, something that happened relatively recently, we got signed up on a book deal together, didn't we?
That's right. It's very exciting with our awareness, behavior, and culture book coming out with the British Computer Society, hopefully sometime next year. Yeah. Really looking forward to that.
Excellent. Look, I'm going to need to ask a big favour of you. My punctuation and grammar is absolutely atrocious. Can I ping in my piece over to you and you can go to have a look for me, because it is that bad.
Well, I'm not making any promises, Bruce.
Okay. So, everybody, the reason why I got on really quickly with Ciaran was the fact that he comes from outside the cybersecurity industry. He's a psychologist at heart, but he's seen some of the challenges we face, and he's really keen and eager to bring some sort of psychological insights to the equation. So he was a natural, really, for bringing onto the show. And I got in contact with him a couple of weeks ago, and Ciaran gratefully accepted our invitation. So without further ado, I'm just going to ask Ciaran. Ciaran, could you tell us really briefly a summary of you being, you're at University College Dublin. You want to just walk through the key points in your life which led to you setting up the Cybersecurity Institute there in Ireland?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Well, to summarise my life in bullet points. Now that's a tall order. I would say my background, as you say, is in psychology, but unlike most people, I have a Bachelor of Science in psychology. So I come from a sort of a hard science experimental background. And when you come from that background doing, chemistry experiments and that sort of thing, you kind of find that once you start studying people, that people are quite difficult to study because people react to how they've been measured. People respond once you tell them that they've got a low IQ or something like that. That doesn't happen if you're dealing with chemicals. And it was those sort of learnings that I got studying psychology at undergraduate level that pushed me into doctoral studies in history and theory of psychology. And this is when you start to understand how people, the language we use to describe ourselves and how we categorize each other and where all of that comes from.
So with that sort of that historical context, is that all about the interaction between people and technology as technology has developed over the course of humanity? You think about the first time people started writing back in the Middle East, and then you had the printing press and those type of things. Your studies involve that understanding of how people change because the technical environment that we're operating within changes.
That's exactly it. I mean, the problem that we have in psychological science is that this sort of stuff is very seldom analysed because you kind of assume that what a person is historically universal, but actually it's not. And it's very difficult to actually find these sort of changes over time because obviously you can't travel back in time, but you can look at how people wrote about themselves at different points in history. And you can find that there's changes in how people talk about each other and what they say about each other at different points in history. And what I generally find is that if there's a change in the medium of communication, the printing press is a big one, but in other ones occur further back in history. So there was one that I was particularly interested in was around about maybe 200, 300, 400 AD when, the method of writing and of writing books in those times were written in scrolls, big long scrolls that you roll out. And around that time, around the 300 AD, the codex, and this is like, it's the book format that we know today. So you've leaves facing each other and it's a lot smaller. It's a lot more compact and it's much easier to transport. It's much easier to copy and it's much easier to hide as well. And when that change occurs, there's a big change in how people understand themselves, how they write about themselves. There's a lot more private reading. There's a lot less social reading and there's a lot more silent reading as well.
Okay.
So doing that kind of research on ancient history, sort of then, I finished up the PhD in the middle of the economic crash. There was not a lot of job openings for philosophers of psychology in 2008 in Dublin, I can tell you.
Right.
But what there was an opening in cybersecurity, which was starting to develop which was developing quite nicely in an institute, the Dunleary Institute of Art, Design and Technology here on the south side of the city. Which to be honest, I didn't really think very much of at the time, but I got hired on the job and I started to apply then what I had understood of historical developments in psychology to much more modern technological developments. So I started studying like social media and things like that.
Okay.
It's unlikely that we can use all of this technology and not be changed in some way. And one of the ways that I think is certainly very different is what I call the Moses coming down from the mountain problem. And this is very important for cybersecurity, actually. And I think that the model that we had in traditional societies, and probably up until quite recently, up until maybe the 1960s, is that somebody can, I would say it's like Moses going up on the mountain. Moses goes up on the mountain, talks to God, and comes down with the commandments and says, these are the laws, you must follow them. And that's kind of, I think, how our societies were run, even up until quite recently. It would be a bunch of guys, usually men, usually quite wealthy, would go into a big house, whether it's Westminster or American Congress or wherever. They would all talk together and then they would come out and say, these are the laws, you must follow them. And that's, I think, the way that information security policy has been delivered up until quite recently. And it's probably still in certain management processes as well, is that the information security officer will talk to the board, to talk to the C-level executives and say, we have to write a policy that people are going to follow. And they would have a chat, and then this policy will then be sent out to the organization as a whole. I don't think you can do that anymore because, and it's been a big cultural change in the West since about the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and it's still affecting, is that you have to actually deal with the people who are going to be affected by this policy. You have to involve them in it. And this is everything from, WikiLeaks to the Occupy Wall Street to nearly every government initiative now has some sort of fact-finding and sort of gathering information from people and requesting submissions from people. And that's how government actually works these days. It might not always seem very effective, but people, the population now expect to be consulted on matters of policy. And that's, I think, is very critical in how you actually deal with these things within an organisation.
So, I mean, the analogy you're drawing there, and I think obviously the audience for the podcast is quite broad. So some people might not necessarily know who Moses was when you use the Moses story, which is a biblical story. I think you're drawing the analogy that almost like Moses takes, goes up to the board, which in your case is what I guess you're relating to God, aren't you? And then between them, maybe God dictates to Moses, and Moses writes it down on the tablet. Then he comes down the mountain, Mount Sinai, and comes down, and in effect he's sort of saying, okay, these are the rules that you'll all live by. And you're sort of drawing the analogy there with security is almost like, the tablet is like the policy document with the expectations of the board defined on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the interesting thing is whether or not the board actually did write those expectations, or whether or not they let Moses do the writing and they just signed it off.
Well, that's an article of faith, really, isn't it? Did Moses just go up there, go around behind a rock and hammer it out himself, or did our Lord actually speak to him? And that's the thing. I mean, it sometimes does seem that. And you can see how this sometimes happens, that within organizations when there's sort of like a crisis or something and the board says to the CISO, look, we're going to have to clamp down on something. And the CISO says, well, there's going to be a problem if you do that. And the board just goes, look, stop people doing this, stop people, ban USB keys, or stop people accessing Facebook on work computers, or clamp down on something. And the CISO knows, in the same way as Moses knows, that people aren't going to like it, but he has to deliver the message anyway. So I think we have to be careful about that whole sort of Old Testament approach to messages coming down. And I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about you need to actually go down and go into people's different working environments, into different divisions, into different units, and see what they do there. And see, because we will find that different organizations, and even in different rooms, different people have different practices that they've managed for their own particular reasons.
Yeah.
If you can kind of be a little bit like Sherlock Holmes, like investigating different organizations and why they do certain things. I mean, it can be down to simple things like, air conditioning and, where the sun enters a room and how warm it gets and why are doors left open. Things like that are always sort of a little bit tricky. And I say, well, we have to leave the door open because it gets very warm in here because there's no air conditioning. And that's why, people are popping in the whole time and, not using their sweat cards, for example. So there's things like that you can only really get to grips with if you actually start to talk to people. I mean, it becomes a much more laborious process, but I think it's one that's much more worthwhile and probably will be more effective long term.
So what you're saying there is if you're sincere in your wish to influence behaviour, you need to understand the behaviours that are currently embedded within the organisation. It's sort of like, I'm thinking, if you don't know the behaviours, if you know what behaviour you want, but you don't know what behaviours are currently in place, how can you plan for bringing things in line? It's almost like a benchmark exercise, isn't it? It's benchmarking behaviours as they are against where you want them to be, and then creating a plan to address that. Would that be an accurate way of summing that up?
I think it's essential in any sort of bureaucratic process that you have a benchmarking exercise carried out. It's very important to do that. But I think it's the benchmark things. But I think we can get kind of hung up, particularly in any sort of IT area, that we get hung up on numbers. And numbers are the sort of thing that I think it becomes a target. The example I always give here is if you're on any motorway, I know you're in miles per hour in the UK, we're in kilometres here, but you'll find that I always notice anyway that if I'm on the motorway here and its motorway speed limit here is 120 kilometres an hour, you notice that the average speed of people is about 120 kilometres an hour. And I kind of think, well, that's a limit. It's a speed limit. It's not a speed target. It's not a recommended speed that you should travel at. It's the heuristic of anchoring is that people are simply just, that's the one number that's out there and that's the number that people focus on. So I think you have to get careful if you're setting benchmarks, because then people get fixated on those things. And you find these sort of problems in all sorts of organizations that once a target is set, then that's what people focus on.
Yeah.
So I think when you're doing your initial surveys of organizations, you have to be careful about the initial target that you set. I think it's more important to try and get qualitative data to understand the context of how people work, rather than just the baseline performance of how they're working.
I think that's a really interesting point, because people often talk about metrics around the challenges of security, education, and awareness. There is a focus upon the number side of it, but I guess I sit behind your position, which is that it's a mixture of qualitative and quantitative metrics, which show us the fuller picture.
Yeah, I mean, it's understanding those sort of things, and there's a lot of different ways you can do it. I mean, qualitative data is notoriously difficult to analyze in the same way. But I think it's that actual process of gathering, of interviewing. And I mean, you can do anonymous surveys with text box. You can have focus groups, one-on-one interviews. There's lots of different ways of doing it. But it's the simple aspect that you're trying to actually scratch below the surface of the numbers, because the numbers will tell you bare facts, but they always have to be interpreted. And if you can't interpret them with respect to the context in which they were gathered, then you're not really going to get very far. I mean, because the thing is, like, no matter what the organization is, you're going to pick up, let's say you've got an organization of 100, 150 people. You're not going to get everybody's response. It's not going to be gender balanced, almost certainly. You're going to have different age profiles. You're going to have different levels of attention from different units. You're going to have different levels of attention, different levels of seniority, and so on. And all of that will necessarily skew the quantitative data that you gather, no matter what it is. So it's important that you can somehow scratch below the surface and actually talk to people and get something a little bit more contextual, a little bit more granular. And that's where your quantitative data comes in.
So tell me then, in your experience, we're sort of reflected upon the fact that if you want to influence behaviour, you need to understand what behaviours are currently prevalent within your organisation. We've reflected upon the fact that in terms of understanding what those behaviours are, there's going to be metrics which are just purely data-driven in terms of numbers, but then there's the qualitative side. As a psychologist, as somebody that's with an understanding or spent years looking at why people behave the way they do, what would be your approach? What would be your recommendation to listeners in terms of, how would you go about doing almost like a root cause analysis about what are the behavioral issues out there within your organization that they need to go away with? Does it start with saying, okay, the objective of this is X, and therefore to achieve X, you need to be looking at doing Y and Z? I'm just trying to get a sense of how you as a psychologist would go about trying to understand what is the behavioral makeup in any organization.
I think probably for me, like to approach these things as a psychologist, as a scientist, you have to really understand, first of all, where exactly is the request coming from? Who and what is the purpose of it before you start gathering any data? So you'd be kind of looking at things like, for example, is this coming from senior management, or is it coming from the CISO, or is it coming from human resources, or whichever way the case is looking at? What exactly are they trying to achieve? Is it ISO certification that they're trying to move towards? Is it to do with GDPR, or is it to do with a specific incident? Because all of those will sort of collaborate, or will sort of focus your question in more specific ways. And then I guess you start to look at, you can be quite strict about the behaviors, because as we've done in the workshops with ISC Squared, I've looked at things like as basic as simply memory for passwords. You can also look at things like using USB keys, and you're looking at things like locking workstations. And it's the funny thing about information security behavior is, realistically, we're looking at, I would estimate, somewhere between 7 and 10 different behaviors that are of most interest within information security. So the things like, as I say, USB keys, things as well like access to different rooms. There's your access control. You've also things like your mobile security and different things like that. And they're quite discrete. Now, I think it's important as well to sort of see like where behavior itself fits in within your overall sort of understanding of information security within an organization, because you can't really complain about people, let's say for example people having bad password policies if they've never been told what the password policy is. So that's your awareness thing. And it's an idea that I've been thinking a lot about recently, is that we have these kind of prescriptions on information security behavior, or on what the human factor is in information security. We have this set of rules. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that we have gone and spoken to, and we've gathered the data, and we've looked at it qualitatively, and we've spoken to everybody in the organization, and we've come up with, this is the new information security policy that everybody's had feedback into. That's your kind of set of rules. But it's something that I've noticed in historical settings as well, is that you have this sort of set of rules, which is kind of like, again, it's like your 10 commandments. But the problem is that in information security, we say, here's the 10 commandments, follow them.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily always give people any sort of technology to help them learn those rules. So I'm going to go a little bit Sunday school here, but if you think about it, Moses, the 10 commandments, or whatever the particular rules there were that you got in Christianity, it was always a kind of a technique, a sort of a practice that helped you keep up with those rules. So for most Christians, that's going to church on a Sunday. And the priest or the vicar will stand up there and say, this is what you're supposed to do, this is what you're not supposed to do. And those of you who did it are going to heaven, and those of you who didn't aren't. And that happened every week. The thing is, we don't necessarily have the same particular things within information security. The thing that comes closest is a sort of newsletter awareness campaign, but doesn't really have the same power or effect in changing behavior as sitting in front of a vicar and him telling you that you're going to burn in hell for all eternity. We need something similar to that, and we need a sort of a practice that's at least as regular as once a week, that actually brings these things home to people. Now, could you actually have a meeting within your organization every week to bring these things home? Now, it wouldn't be feasible, but you can be sure, if you got everybody in an organization to pay attention for an hour a week to information security policies and behavior and culture and all of that, you would start to see change. So it's that sort of level of impact. So that's one thing I've noticed, is that we need a sort of a routine or a practice. The other thing I've noticed as well is that every other sort of major cultural change that's happened throughout history, when you're trying to impact a sort of a set of rules, is that there's usually not just the collective Sunday school thing, but there's usually sorts of smaller kind of book or text of some kind. So I know in Britain you have the, what's it called? The Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer probably governed England for about 400 years fairly successfully, that everybody stuck to that sort of rule book. Roman Catholics have a catechism. In China, they have Mao's Little Red Book. And that's the thing that you're kind of missing in information security, is that we could really use, and this is because obviously it's an awful lot younger and it's an awful lot more complicated. But if you're saying to somebody, and this is kind of something that we're missing, and this is where your podcast comes in, Bruce. If somebody says to you, I don't work in information security, I work in an office, and I need to know more about what I'm supposed to do. I want to be able to understand it. I want to be able to do it automatically. Is there any like Mao's Little Red Book, or is any Book of Common Prayer of information security that you could just say, here you go, read this, learn this, live it and breathe it, and you'll understand all about it, and your behavior will change alongside it, and you can match your behavior to what's specified in this book? We don't have that.
Then I guess some people would argue that that's the corporate security policy, or the corporate security guidelines, or the security book, or whatever. So some people would argue that
that is the parallel with what you're saying in terms of the little book, that you described that have brought around so many really significant cultural changes over the years.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think it should be. I think that's what your organizational policy should be. But at the same time, most of those policies are usually fairly dry, bare, black text on white HTML pages that is usually written in a kind of a legalese, no disrespect to lawyers or anything, but it's not something that makes people want to read it.
Yeah.
It's not something that usually, this is where they have to be readable. There also has to be some kind of, I think there needs to be a sort of an interactivity to them. There has to be some sort of way that we can, and this is one thing that I actually have a really big problem with is passwords. So we always say to people, your password has to be, we've kind of moved away a bit from you have to change your password every month sort of thing. But we still say that your password has to be very long and it has to be complex and you have to memorize it and don't write it down anywhere. But do we give people any training in how to do that? No, we rarely do. It's usually this is the text box into which you input it in, and you'll get a pop-up warning if it doesn't meet those criteria. We don't actually give people any help to do that. So I think we need, like, the company policy is one thing, but it should say, and this goes for an awful lot of other areas in information security as well, because you'd often see advice that will say, make sure that you encrypt sensitive documents. It doesn't tell you how to encrypt them or what tools you should use. It just says you should encrypt them. And it's the same as says you should use a complicated password, but it doesn't say how you memorize it or what tools you should, or what sort of, how you can help yourself learn off passwords.
Yeah. I think what you're sort of, I guess you're alluding to there is something that I've seen over the years in terms of, somebody says like, this is the policy, but then there's no explanation about how people achieve that. A great one would be, the point about, something that I know that you pick up on in the workshops is the sense of, the clear desk, the clear desk policy. And it's like, the policy says that you've got to remove all confidential information has to be removed by the end of the day, so you can't leave your desk, go home, whatever it is, if you've still got confidential information on your desk. And then people turn around and go, well, what's confidential information?
Yeah.
And this sort of reminds me of the work I've done around behavioral economics, where and you use people like Cialdini talk about making something easy. So it's like by not defining it, you're making it easy for them to opt out. Okay, or if you actually define what you mean by the policy, i.e. what is the process to achieve the policy, and you design it to be as easy as possible to get to the end of that process, then you're more likely to actually influence behavior. And I think that's sort of, listening to what you're saying is a sense of, if you don't define things well, if you're not clear, okay, then the chances of you influencing behavior are pretty slim. And again, going back to the workshops that we do together, the question that you raised, the same question that I raised is, what do we mean by behavior? What is security behavior? And that comes back to the question, the point you raised earlier, which is, what is the purpose of the exercise? Is it to influence behavior? What do you mean by behavior?
Yeah.
Which I think which is interesting, because if you don't define behavior, then you're sort of going to go off in all manner of directions anyway, aren't you? So
it's things that I think are starting to become more clarified now with a lot more legislative and regulatory frameworks that are coming in, so that businesses are kind of focusing more on that, which is good. But like, for example, in GDPR, like there's this clause where you don't necessarily have to notify your data protection commission of a breach. I think I have this right. If the data itself is unreadable, so if it's encrypted, you don't have to tell anybody. So this is going to be, a lot more data is going to end up being encrypted. But that means that you're going to have a lot of people, like there's nothing particularly within the regulation, and it probably shouldn't be really, of how you actually go about what level of encryption and how you actually go about encrypting the data. And that's kind of like a tricky thing, because if you look at, say, for example, encrypting documents in Microsoft Word and places like that is relatively straightforward. You can password protect them and then they're encrypted. That's one way of doing it. But if you're trying to get down to the level of encrypting emails, you're looking at things like PGP and S-MIME and things like that. And that is very complicated. And there's no two ways about this, is that encrypting emails is prohibitive for most people. And that is going to be, I'm not entirely sure if that's going to come through in GDPR, but it's this sort of thing that fundamentally an awful lot of end user security products or security practices are very, very complicated and don't necessarily lend themselves very well to the average end user. So that's the thing, is that how you actually define that behavior of how you define you need to encrypt information is pretty critical, really. So that's kind of like it's sort of more of a policy aspect to it. But again, it's when we talk about, within the workshops about the different behaviors, I've simply gone for probably the easiest way of looking at things of the most common information security behaviors that are actually spoken about within the information security literature. You can look at behavior in quite a number of different ways, and it's difficult because human behavior can be ascribed in a lot of different ways. And historically within psychology, it was always sort of, well, if you can observe it and measure it, that's behavior. But as you know yourself, an awful lot of the most interesting things that people do aren't observable at all. They're all internal. And if you can't measure that, or if I can't observe what's going on in your head, then is it no longer scientifically interesting? Well, that was a position in psychology up until about 1920. And then they realized that actually society is very interested in what happens in a person's head. So we have to figure out a way of scientifically dealing with it. And that's when you get sort of questionnaires and things like that. And you get sort of self-report measures. And self-reports, if you're saying, yes, I do this, and yes, I don't I do all of the good things and I don't do all of the bad things. And I'm ticking these boxes on a sheet or in a questionnaire isn't necessarily going to be foolproof. And so that's the other sort of problem with your quantitative methods, is that people aren't necessarily going to be very honest with you. I mean, I always say as well, and I've mentioned it in the workshops, is that if you want to understand, I guess, the security behaviors of all of the employees in this organization, all of the end users of this network, ideally, you would like to be able to have total visibility of everything that happens on the network. So you would understand you would have real data of what goes on. Nobody's ever going to have that. It's impossible to collect all of that data. And I mean, could the average security engineer give you accurate data on every time that users incorrectly inputted passwords when they were logging onto their workstations? Could they actually collect that data? Probably could, but it would be very, very difficult. What would it actually show? Well, I mean, I'm just using it as an example, but if you look at all of the other things that you would be interested in, you'd be looking at, when they put in USB keys, do they scan them for viruses? How often are their workstations unlocked? It'd be an interesting product if you could say to an organization, we have this system, we're going to put it into your network and it's going to give you all of those behaviors. I don't think it would be worth very much. But it's the problem with that, is that with something like that, and this came up in the workshops, is that people will find ways around it.
Yeah.
So one of the things that was mentioned in the workshop was about the people logging or putting a timer on automatically logging themselves out from the workstation. People said, well, that is, it's a Microsoft system control that you can put in. And the guys, I think half the classroom answered, well, there's a way around that. You can do X, Y, and Z. So people will always find ways to beat the numbers, no matter which way you set them up.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, one of the things you talk about is, understanding behavior. And in that you talk about things like deterrence and compliance. And, I think one of the interesting observations you make is the concept that you can come up with a penalty for breaking a policy, but the severity of that doesn't really seem to have an impact on whether or not people really comply with it or not. Is that right?
I think fundamentally people believe in, it's another sort of a cognitive bias, is that people believe it's in a just world, is that, things should be fair
And, it kind of links into people believing in karma and so on. That people believe that the system that they work in should be fair and it should be just and should be, reasonable. So it's a problem that again, it's similar to the example that I gave earlier on, that when something happens in an organization, like there's a breach or there's, companies losing money, and the board say to the CISO, we need to change policy, we need to tighten up on something because we're losing money. And inevitably what they will say is something like, we need to increase the punishment for breaking policy. And what you will find is, and what the research has shown, is that when you actually do that, when you increase the severity of the punishment, is that people will actually be less likely to go along with the new policy, because they find that the adjustment, that the change is unfair, and they react against it. So that's it's a kind of a counterintuitive thing from when you look at it from a distance. But if you understand it as a person in that situation, so if the policy, if the crime that you've committed that you thought was a fairly minor one, you're going to react against it because you think that it's silly, you believe that you should be treated justly, and you react against it in this way. And that's, it's the way that people kind of rationalize things that takes a little bit of working out in these situations.
So I think it's quite interesting there, where you sort of like, people have this sort of inbuilt bias, which is around justice and reasonableness and doing the right thing. And does that sort of, in a way, sort of emphasize the need to communicate clearly to people what the actual impact of their decision to break a policy might be? Because maybe their view of it is not a complete and thorough understanding of what the impact of a breach of policy is or could be. So do you think that's what's missing there, is the sense of they would probably understand why there is a need for severity if they actually understood what the impact of the breach of policy was, to the organisation, to individuals within the organisation, to customers, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think by giving that additional insight that it helps counteract the biases that you were talking about?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think the biggest problem that we're up against, or one of the perception problems that we have in information security, is that fundamentally all of this stuff is invisible. But even to the systems engineer or to anybody working at the coalface in information technology or in information security, all of this stuff is invisible. Like, we're storing, huge amounts of information on these very small devices, and we can't it's intangible. We can't get a sense of any of it. So when somebody breaks a policy, if they do something that's against the policy rules, it's fundamentally because they can't see the consequences of it, and because they're under some other motivational pressure to do so. So I think that's very important, that you actually show people what the consequences of these things are.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily have to scare them too much, but you show them what they've exposed, and you show them what how to visualize these things. Mm-hmm. I think that's possibly going to be a growth industry within information security in the next couple of years to come, is actually data visualization, so that you can actually show back to the end user what they have actually what they've exposed and the sort of mistakes that they've made. It's a tricky one, but I think that's something that industry should really focus on in the years to come.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's part of telling the story, the compelling story, is actually being able to see how it actually materializes in the life around them, or even something as distant as the customer that they've never come across before, but whose data they handle sort of unknowingly, maybe day in, day out, and actually how, when there is a breach, how that affect that customer, for example. So I sort of feel behind you on how that story element, the actual, putting it into something visually that people can understand, is really important. So one of the things you talk about is certainty of detection. And then it's almost like, to most people, it's like, well, yeah, for sure. But in effect, what you're sort of arguing is that if people don't believe that they are likely to be detected if they breach the policy, then statistically, there are more people that are likely to actually decide not to comply with the policy. Now, that seems like common sense, but something there says to me there's a reason behind that, and it might be worth people
understanding that. So do you think you can explain what you mean there, where you've come from with that particular statement?
Well, I think the research shows that, generally speaking, if people know that they're going to be caught when they break the law, and it goes to a wider organizational point as well, that if people know that everybody, no matter who they are, will be caught and will be punished the same, then they understand that it's a just law. But I think it's a wider problem in not just in information security, but in crime and in legislation generally, is that there really is no point in making things illegal if you can't enforce them.
Yeah.
And there's no point in actually doing that sort of thing. And if you can't actually do that, if you don't have the power to do that, which in a lot of Western liberal societies, governments don't have the power to do an awful lot of that sort of thing, then you have to approach the problem from a different way. You have to approach it from more of an educational one. And that's the thing. It goes more to the point of your visibility on the network. If you can't detect when people are breaking policy, then maybe you have to ask yourself, is this the best way to actually achieve this? Is, making this behavior prohibitive if you're not going to be able to detect when it happens anyway?
Yeah.
So is there not a different way of doing things? And if you can't, prohibit against that behavior, well, then maybe it will be a better thing to actually reward the positive behavior rather than punishing the negative behavior, if you see what I mean. And that kind of goes to how people react to punishments. I mean, behaviorism within psychology would always say that it's better off to reward behavior that you want to continue rather than to punish behavior that you don't want to continue. Now, you can't, and that's the sort of thing, you know, Bruce, you have kids, that if a child does something, you don't want them to do it. The best thing is usually to ignore it.
Yeah. If you can.
If you can. Now, in an organizational setting, that mightn't always be possible to do that. But I think the example that I would always give is when you're talking about locking workstations. And, we've talked to a lot of different organizations about this. And I always remember there was one, I can't remember where we were in Amsterdam, and we were talking about these sort of like, you can have formal policies for punishment, or you can have sort of informal policies. And this was about making sure that people logged out of their workstation. And there was all these sort of, you remember lots of different people were saying, well, in our organization, if you leave your computer logged in, people are allowed to order pizza from your account and order pizza from the whole day. And it's all funny because you come back and everybody's eating pizza and you have to pay for it. And I remember, I think there was one guy that we met, possibly in Amsterdam. He said, "Yeah, we used to have that policy in our organization that your machine was, it was open season on your machine if you left it logged in." And he said, then someday, I think it was an officer, I think he might have been in the army. He said that left his machine logged in, and somebody sent, a unit-wide email from his account. And it was funny, but it just went a little bit too far. And the officer in question was very angry, was upset, and because it was technically, he had breached policy, but somebody in sending an email from his account to punish him had breached an even more serious policy.
Yeah.
And the thing is, that was like, he's getting punished for the behavior, but punishment is tricky because punishment can go too far. And so I think what the best examples that I always come from are not punishing the person, but actually rewarding everybody else. So if you look into a room and you find that everybody's gone to lunch and everybody's logged out apart from one person, I always think that the nicest example I've heard in this case is that you leave a chocolate on everybody's desk apart from the one person who's still logged in. So you're positively, informally, and rewarding the behavior that you want to continue. You're just simply ignoring the behavior that you don't want to continue. So that's a sort of a policy that I think it's an approach to developing policy that I think is worthwhile considering. It's not going to work in every context, but in those ones it works well.
Okay. So often we talk about, what are the motivations behind why people decide, to not comply with that policy. So there's that point of, so you've been made aware of it, you've signed the document, you've passed the tests, and then it's like, but they still have a point. I call it the point of discretionary effort, where
they find themselves in a situation where they have to, one, recognize the situation for what it is, two, remember the policy that's relevant to it, three, make a choice about whether or not to actually comply with the policy, you know? And one of the things we talk about, which I think is really interesting, is how people neutralize. They know of the existence of the policy, they know that they've signed up to it, but they neutralize it. I'm sort of getting this idea of a positive electron against negative, and it's like it neutralizes somehow. And so you talk about a couple of things like the metaphor of the ledger, which I always love a metaphor, and then you talk about the defense of necessity. Do you think you could just sort of explain what you mean by the metaphor of the ledger?
Yeah, it's from a great paper by Harrith and Rowe in 2009. And it's basically, and I mean, it's common through a number of different theories in the human sciences. But the idea is that people sort of say, well, I've done this bad thing. I've broken policy, and that's like a minus the score. You know, it's coming out of the account. But I also work very hard for the company, and I do an awful lot of very good work, and I stay late. So that's a positive. So that's an investment. So between the two things, you know, it's like a ledger. It cancels itself out. So really, me doing this bad thing is not actually that bad at all. It's just neutral. And so this is the way that people sort of rationalize their behaviors. And you'll find this is common in an awful lot of aspects of human life, is that people sort of weigh things up and they say, you know what, maybe I did do this bad thing, but I've enough in credit with the company to allow for this. And I think it's a very useful way of sort of understanding how people approach these things and how they rationalize them to themselves.
So it's a bit like me when I go out I try and run a minimum twice a week, ideally 3 times a week. And it's not unusual if I get out early enough in the evening to come back and to grab myself a beer. And it's like, I've done all that good stuff with the run, and now it's like, I'm going to have the beer. And now when I explain that is definitely my ledger. That's for sure. It's a great example of neutralization in effect. Okay. So what about defensive necessity?
This is sort of, it's from the same paper. This is kind of what people will do when they say, okay, and you will usually find this late on a Friday evening when people have a deadline to meet, and they will say, okay, I shouldn't have borrowed a password to access that file or to get into that area, but we've got a deadline coming, we have to get this job finished. So people will say that they had to do these things because they were trying to do extra work. They were trying to complete their job. And this is a tricky one because I think an awful lot of people will find this one occurring quite often. Is that people would do these things because they have to get the job done. And the thing is, and you know as much about this as I do, that this says an awful lot about company culture. It says an awful lot about the values that are within an organization. It says an awful lot about how much they value their employees. It says an awful lot about how much they care about information security. Because realistically, you shouldn't have to break policy to complete your job.
I mean, in effect, it's sort of reflecting upon things that we've discussed in the past, and actually we sort of alluded to earlier in today's podcast as well, that if you design something poorly, okay, and the user experience is a poor one and definitely doesn't meet the expectations, then people are going to find a different way of getting to what they want. So if your policy gets in the way of people doing their work in an unreasonable way, then they're more inclined to actually feel, they've got the defense of necessity. I need to get this done. The policy gets in the way. And in a way, I guess it also, I wonder if there's any other neutralization going on in the sense of I need to get this done, which is all about winning this major contract, for example. And, the benefit of winning the contract outweighs the perceived potential risk of using a USB or exchanging a password or maybe using a third party outside the organization to transfer a large data file to get it to, one of your other business partners or something like that.
And I mean, it's It's typical. I think it happens a lot. I think it's probably going to continue for quite a while. But it's these sort of instances, I think, are symptomatic of where information security currently rests as a priority, and how it's as a priority within organizations and within our society at large. Because it's difficult. Information security is a difficult, complicated process. It involves technology, it involves people, it involves regulations, and it's tricky. But if your organization is running well, information security isn't going to make that harder. It's going to make it easier in the long term. So it helps you. It should be like a guiding principle of how you organize and how you develop your organization as it goes forward. And if you think about it in those ways as not an obstacle to overcome, but rather a sort of a strength, an extra strength to your arsenal, then it's something that I don't think you should see those sort of conflicts.
So tell me, one of the things you talk about is the role of the trust relationship between employees and the organization, and how if employees perceive themselves not to be trusted by the organization itself, how that will potentially lead to an increased likelihood that employees will abuse their access to systems and information contrary to the organization's security policies. That trust piece, I think, is often, in the early days, I remember with security, when I was involved with security awareness campaigns, the story was very much told from the organizational perspective. And a lot of people got a sense that, they were being continually monitored, which suggested to them that they weren't trusted. And I just wonder what you think about, because it also, that statement about trust seems to be contrary to an earlier statement, which was about if people don't feel that they're being monitored or they'll be caught and held accountable, then they are more likely to breach policy. And then we have this other statement from one of the research papers that you identified in 2011, which says, well, if people feel that they're not trusted, they're more likely to breach policy. Are these two statements, in effect, negating each other?
Not necessarily, because I think in the first instance, we're talking about if people know that they're going to be caught doing something wrong, then they don't do it. It's sort of a visibility thing. But there's a difference, I think, between certainty of detection and being trusted. I think they're two different things. And I think they're possibly related, but we're talking about probabilities here. We're not talking about that people will definitely do X if Y. It's talking about more likelihoods. I think that the wider problem here is, and when we're talking about trust, is when you're talking about trust and you're talking about individuals feeling that their organizations trust them. I think what we're really talking about is an alignment of the individual's values to the organization's values. And I think what's very important here, and it's been said by many other information security experts other than myself, is that it's very important from an information security perspective, from a human resources perspective, but particularly from a information security perspective, is to understand if there are people within your organization who have access to sensitive information and who are disillusioned.
Yeah.
Because these are the sort of people who, for example, if they're on a temporary contract and it's not renewed, or if they are, they feel like they're not getting paid properly, or that they're being passed over for promotion, these are the sort of people who have access to sensitive information. And this is where your compartmentalization and your access controls to different information is very important. These are the sort of people. The classic case is, of course, Edward Snowden. But, of course, he's not the only one. It's common enough within information technology for individuals like this to walk out with a lot of information under their arm and never come back. So there's lots of different sort of, methods that have been used over the years to sort of try and find these people out. But I think what's probably the most sensible thing to do in this sort of context is to understand does everybody in this organization believe in the organization and what it does? Or are we employing people here who don't agree with what we do? And that's the sort of situation that you have to think about. Is everybody happy to work here? Because if people are happy to work in the organization, then they will be happy to go along with information security policies, because it's an element of trust between them, because they understand that there's organizational justice. So it's these sort of, I think this is why your podcast is so important, is that these are the sort of things that we're now talking about within information security. We're talking about all of these soft skills. We're talking about these cultural processes, which we often don't, which we haven't done, and which I think is becoming increasingly important that we do, to sort of understand better how things go wrong.
Yeah. It goes back to the early part of the podcast, really. This is providing the context that surrounds the people, the employees or the contractors, whoever it is. We're trying to ask them to continue to do the good stuff they're doing, or to change their behaviors to manage risk, in line with the organization's appetite for risk, which is in the policy. That whole sense of, to do that, to be more successful than we currently are, and to be able to demonstrate you've taken some reasonable and appropriate steps, you've got to understand the context within which people are making those decisions. And that comes to, the point you're making around, shared values between employees and the organization is a really important one. When I talk about, for example, culture in the workshop that you and I lead on, I think I often talk about what are the values of the organization, and not the ones that are written down necessarily on paper, but what are the real ones?
Yeah.
And then what are the values of the people? I think it's quite interesting, because one of the challenges that organizations have is, are the people that are working for us because they want to work for us, because they believe in what we do, but they believe they have shared values, or are they here to earn money?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing particularly wrong with that, but it's sort of you're not always going to be able to get everything to line up, because you don't want to run a cult as your organization. But if somebody is diametrically opposed to what you're doing, then you have a problem, particularly if they have access to sensitive information. And I mean, there's ways around it. There are different sort of, I guess, approaches that you can take, but it is important that you can actually have some cognizance of that, and how you go around that, and how you deal with it. So it's it's a tricky one, but I think it's something that we do have to at least have some sort of thought towards, because this is, the very nature of, it can be overstated as well. It's the nature of information security, and information security's relationship to hacking, and the relationship of hacking to authority. And there always has been a sort of, I wouldn't necessarily say a conflict, but there's certainly been a tension there between those sort of, not even two different communities, but two different spheres, because you have information security and cybersecurity was very much close relationship to corporations and to business, and you have hacking, which is hacking culture, which has always had and probably will always have notions of kind of anarchism and anti-authoritarianism. So that's just something that I think has to be kind of appreciated a little bit more at corporate level.
Okay, right. Well, I guess something that would be really useful, almost as a bit of a summary, is to sort of, you talked about the soft skills.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you sort of alluded to the fact that, those people become more in the cybersecurity space, from your experience as being a psychologist looking in, that people are becoming more open to soft skills, which might be of help. Can you just think off the top of your head, one of the things I do in the workshops, I think in the last one, I was like really trying to get across to people that, security people are all choice architects. So go and have a way, look at choice architecture, go and do some research around it. And I've talked about, behavioral economics. From a behavioral perspective, can you sort of think, okay, these are the sort of subject areas that I would say, take that away and go and do some research around it. Because if you do it properly, you'll find some gems in there that might help you steer how you go around trying to, influence behavior in a positive way within your organization when it comes to security.
I did. The only thing that actually comes to mind is probably completely off the wall, but I think it's worthwhile for anybody in security or anybody in life to get a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. I think it's a Roman emperor from the 2nd century. His daily meditations that he wrote. He's a Stoic philosopher. I think it's the sense of calmness and the sense of reflection. I think there's an awful lot that runs through. I mean, it's not really, it's not a book that you just sit down and read. It's something that you would pick up and refer to and reflect upon from time to time. I have one on my desk. I think it gives me a certain amount of distance and detachment from things, which I think is something that certainly think information security needs. And it's a certain amount of, it's a philosophy of self-respect and of respect for other people, which I think is something that is kind of missing within information security, because we're tending to, and it's something that I've mentioned a lot with you before, it's dealing with people rather than as end users. And I know I've used that term a couple of times myself, but it's trying to understand other people, the other people at the end of the network, and how they exist as people, and how they live and how they operate. So that would be my recommendation. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations.
Okay, right. I got Marcus Aurelius. I've got it. And yeah, actually, it is a really fascinating read. It's one of those top two to read type of books. And Marcus Aurelius, he was one of the, forgot what the Caesars were called, the 5 emperors, the 5 of them. I think they're called the Great Five or the Wise Five or something like that.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. And also Marcus Aurelius was the emperor in the Gladiator film.
That's right.
I don't think he ever got that close to the front line, to be honest with you. But I think for the film they pushed him right up there in the cold in Germania. So yes.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So you definitely take away the Marcus Aurelius one for reading, and I guess the other side is on the behavioural side. One of the things that we do in our monthly newsletter, I basically highlight a book that's been core to helping me get to grips with how I might want to rethink the human factor, and resulted in the SABAC framework we developed. And so, when it comes to behavioural science, I mean, I mentioned behavioural economics, you've got the behavioural sciences, you've got, sociology, there's psychology. So, there's a range of disciplines there that I think are worth people picking up and getting a book. It's not going to make you an expert in that field. But what I think it does do, like Marcus Aurelius's book does, it allows you to reflect and maybe think about, actually, that could be applied. And what I now need to do is, now I can see the connection. I need to speak to somebody like a psychologist, like yourself, for example, who can maybe say, okay, well, yeah, if this is your objective, then this is the type of things you need to be considering from a deeply personal perspective, from the perspective of the people that you're trying to influence, how they make those choices, which would seem to be almost foolish not to consider that when you're designing a policy or a process or a procedure.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Great. Great to talk through some of the points that I've heard from you talking about in workshops and presentations that you've done on the particular challenge. So I'm sure that the listeners will have taken away a lot from this. Yeah,
excellent.
It's been great to have you on the show. Really do appreciate the time. Obviously, we've had some interference with the line quality between here in the UK and Dublin. Let's hope that Brexit doesn't make it any worse.
Thank you very much, Bruce. An absolute pleasure.
Well, I hope you found that conversation with Ciaran there of some interest. I know I did. As per usual, there are plenty of notes on my desk, but the challenge comes in trying to identify what I think are maybe the key points for us to take away from that conversation. So here we go. 4 or 5 points that I thought were really quite interesting. The first one is right at the beginning of the interview. Ciaran talked about how he has studied at an undergraduate and a postgraduate level the impact on people's behavior from advancements in technology. And I referenced, for example, starting with the first written form, which was in the Middle East and Samaria. And then we talked about, the change in the printing press. But the one thing that Ciaran sort of, I guess, highlighted, which was specifically of interest to him, was how we went from the rolled scrolls with all the information. We used to read from rolled scrolls. And then we moved to the book, which is what we're used to reading from nowadays. And obviously that's moved on a little bit further. But he sort of highlighted the fact, he studied that one change, the impact that had upon society and culture and how behaviors were formed. And I think that's really interesting. And then I think it's really interesting because this, to me, is what choice architecture is about. The environments that we build, that we live within, are designed in a way to have an impact, knowingly or unknowingly, upon our choices, the choices that we make. So, even though he didn't mention the phrase choice architecture, I would strongly recommend that you go and do some research around choice architecture. For me, this is going to be a big thing for the security industry going forward. It's been a core part of the message that I've been delivering over the last 6 years at events like the Information Security Forum, InfoSec Europe, and ISC Squared. So please take that away. Go and have a quick Google search on choice architecture. The second point that he dealt with, these were more specifics, was the issue of deterrence. So this seems like a no-brainer, but basically, if people believe that they are being monitored for their compliance and that they will be held account when they breach that compliance, they are much more likely to comply. No-brainer. But a lot of the people I speak to day in, day out, when we talk about these issues around education awareness, a lot of those people say, well, look, people don't always understand that they're being monitored, or where they understand they're being monitored, people get away with it. And so I think that what we're creating there is an environment where, people won't comply because they know people get away with it, or they're just not even aware that they're being monitored. So I think it was, straightforward point, but an important one. The severity of the penalty has a negative effect, according to Ciaran. As I say, people, in effect, will say, okay, if there's a breach of this particular policy, I'm going to get fired. And actually they say, well, that's pretty unreasonable. And their reasonableness is based upon their perception of the impact and repercussions of actually breaching the policy. This is really important. We did some research last year, which is going to be released before the end of this year, which is, showing that people have, if they don't actually really understand the impact of a breach of that policy or a breach of confidentiality, then they really do fail to understand the severity of what it is that they're doing. And so what they do is they automatically put that down as this is pretty unreasonable. And so they're less likely to actually comply. The third point, which Ciaran raised for us, was the issue of neutralisation. And he used a couple of metaphors for that. The one that I found really of interest was the metaphor of the ledger. It's where people believe they work really hard and they work long hours and they feel that they're absolutely committed to the organisation. So they have this almost expectation that with all that hard work that they do and all the good that they do, that every now and then it's justifiable to breach a policy. So that's one of the things you call the metaphor of the ledger, and that's all about neutralisation. The other one is the defence of necessity. And this is something when I speak to people, I come across quite often, where people feel that it's necessary to breach the security policies to get the job done. And maybe that's true, but the thing for me that sort of highlights is how well do we design our policies with the user in mind? And that's one of the things we want to be doing going forward in the series, is actually speaking to people about process design and how maybe improved process design will actually lead to better results. And anybody that's seen me present around behavioral economics or has done any research around behavioral economics will understand that actually this concept about better designing policy to result in more positive outcomes is something that governments all around the world, private sector businesses and not-for-profits have started to understand and to accommodate into how they go around designing their organizational process. Really, really important point. Defense of necessity, have a look at that. And the spin out of that for me is, behavioral economics. And a final point that Ciaran raised, which I think is worthy of note, is that people have an internal sense of what is right and wrong. So, justice has to be balanced. And people need to know that actually, if they comply with policy and other people don't, that's pretty unfair. And the end result is that those people that would normally comply with policy will at some point, under the right circumstances, will find themselves actually making a decision not to comply. So there's this inbuilt thing that we all have, which is that one way of putting it might be, fairness. And if they see other people being allowed to breach policy without being held accountable, they will think that's unfair, which means they're much more likely not to comply with policy themselves. So I think maybe 5 or 6 key points there from Ciaran, and I hope you find them of interest. Take them offline and maybe do some research around those. One thing to just highlight to you, we're hoping to get Dan Arley on board to do a podcast around behavioral economics. I'm also talking to a number of other people who look at behavioral economics and choice architecture. So, those topics are going to be discussed by specialists moving forward. Talking about moving forward, what's the best way for you to stay informed of the podcast? There's a couple of really simple ways that you can do that. The first way is to visit the Marmalade Box website, sign up for the newsletter, and that newsletter is going to sort of be a hash of all the really interesting stuff that we're doing around awareness, behavior, and culture at Marmalade Box. The second thing that you can do is that you can follow us upon Twitter at Marmalade Box. So we will be sharing the content that we're sort of curating around awareness, behavior, and culture, and Twitter is one of the ways that we'll be doing that. The third way that you can stay in contact with what we're up to here at the podcast and Marmalade Box is to follow us upon LinkedIn. So, whether you follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or you sign up to our newsletter, what is it that you're actually signing up to? We're absolutely committed to ongoing research into the challenges of awareness, behavior, and culture. And as part of that, we are absolutely committed to identifying disciplines, people who specialize in those disciplines or have experience in those disciplines, and developing relationships with them to try and get them to come and join us here at the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast to share their insights to help the security community more effectively address the universal challenges of awareness, behavior, and culture. That is going to include, the podcast at one end. We've got the blogs and articles as well. We have the book reviews and recommendations. We also, highlight work that we think is really interesting in the area of awareness, behavior, and culture. And we hope that that source will be of some value to those within the information security community who have been given that challenge of awareness, behavior, and culture. Okay, so what is the next podcast that we're going to be releasing at the end of October? This is actually a slight deviation from the norm, and I think that's pretty good. This deviation is going to be all about inviting a senior security professional or a senior professional who has a lot of exposure to security to share with us 6 key lessons they've learned from listening to the podcast today. We think that this is really an exciting twist in our story. This is about a listener actually saying, okay, I listened to these and these are the key points that I've taken away. And then I'm going to have that conversation with the guest and we're going to sort of explore those 6 points. So I think that's going to be really interesting. And I think the security community will be able to associate even more closely with somebody who comes from within the security industry or has a strong reputation within the security industry and who has talked or has faced these particular challenges that this podcast is all about. I hope you can join us. If you need reminding, just remember sign up to the newsletter, join us on Twitter, or join us on LinkedIn. Thanks very much for listening in. I'm really looking forward to bringing our next guest and insights to you at the end of next month. Bye.